right, hi everyone. So this is our last video on the tissues chapter. This is a really big chapter. So we are going to finish up talking about muscle tissue and nervous tissue, and then a few additional tissue topics like tissue repair and membranes. Okay, so let's talk about muscle tissue. So the overall function of muscle tissue is to move, right? So movement is the function. And in order to do that, muscle tissue has to be able to stretch and shorten. So contract and relax, all right? That's how it creates movement. All right. And so there are three different types of muscle that we're going to talk about. So the first one is skeletal muscle. And so skeletal muscle is attached to bones via tendons. All right, so you find it attached to bones. All right, and so its function is voluntary muscle movement. Okay, so these are any muscles you can voluntarily control. Those are going to be skeletal muscles. All right, so voluntary movement. Okay, so they're going to be attached to bones via tendons. All right, and remember, tendons are made of dense, regular connective tissue, which we talked about before. So with each of these types of muscle, we'll talk about what the cells look like and how they're different from each other. So those are going to be our cell characteristics. So the cell characteristics for skeletal muscle, these are going to be very long, cylindrical cells. All right. So they're very long threads. And so you can see, like, this would be one muscle cell. And this would be another muscle cell here, all right? And this muscle cell would keep going. Some muscle cells are even as long as the actual muscle itself. So if you think about your biceps muscle, right, and your upper arm, you would have a muscle cell, right, many muscle cells traveling the entire length of that bicep muscle. So they can be very long, these skeletal muscle cells. They are multinucleated. Whoops. All right, so each muscle cell has more than one nucleus. They have many nuclei. All right, so they're multinucleated, and they are striated. And so striated is just that striped appearance you see in the picture. That is the striation, so it's striped. Okay, so these are the striations, these little stripes, the dark and white alternating lines. Those are striations. And when we do our muscle chapter, you'll learn about what those striations are and why they're important. Okay, and then also for each muscle, we're going to make a note of the ability for that muscle to regenerate. So how well can it regenerate? And so with skeletal muscle, regeneration is limited. So there's some, but it is very limited. All right. So limited regeneration. And so the reason for that is because these cells are so big and so long, and they have multiple nuclei. That makes it very difficult for them to divide. Because remember, with mitosis, you have to divide the contents of the nucleus. So these cells would have to split the contents of every single nucleus into opposite sides of the cell and coordinate that across the entire length of the muscle cell. So that would become difficult. And so there are stem cells in muscle tissue that can produce new muscle cells, since that process of mitosis with one muscle cell isn't really feasible. So these would be from stem cells. All right, and so that wouldn't be a very common process, but it can happen to kind of rebuild muscle tissue. Okay, so that's our skeletal muscle. That's our voluntary muscle. Any muscle you can think about and move voluntarily, all right, from thinking about it, that is going to be skeletal muscle. Our next category is cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is found in the heart, all right? That's the cardiac part of cardiac muscle. The function of cardiac muscle is to pump the heart, right? Contraction of the heart, so pumping blood. Okay. And so it is also involuntary, all right? So you don't think about your heart pumping. So it involuntarily pumps blood through the heart. All right, thank goodness you don't have to think about it, right? That would be a lot to keep up with. Okay, so then cell characteristics for these cardiac muscle cells. They are branched cells. All right, so let's look at that. So we have, let's see. Let's say this is one cell here, all right? And it branches off into two little branches that connect to another cell. So this cell also has two branches here. All right, so they have little branches coming off. So they're branched cells, and they're connected by special cell junctions. So they're connected by what are called intercalated discs. All right, so intercalated discs are the cell junctions specifically found between cardiac muscle cells. And so you can see those here. All right, and you can also see them on the actual microscope picture. They're like these dark lines. Those are the intercalated discs. And so intercalated discs are made of desmosomes and gap junctions. All right. And so they form a very strong connection between the muscle cells because of the desmosomes, and then the gap junctions allow those cardiac muscle cells to communicate with each other. And then that way the heart, when it contracts, all those cells can contract together because they're in communication with each other. Okay, and so typically with these cells, we also only see one nucleus per cell. All right, so they have a single nucleus in each cell. Okay. And they are also striated, similar to our skeletal muscle. So they're striated as well. All right, so that striation is just coming from the arrangement of the proteins inside of the cell that cause that muscle to contract. So they're arranged in a way that makes them look striped. And the same thing is true for the skeletal muscle. All right, and so then our last type of muscle is smooth muscle. Okay, and so smooth muscle is found in many of the internal organs. All right, so like your digestive organs are always a good example of this. And so the function of this smooth muscle is involuntary contraction of those organs. All right, so it's involuntary contraction. Okay, and so a few examples of this would be like the churning of your stomach. Okay, so stomach, your blood vessels are lined with smooth muscle. So when your blood vessels constrict and get smaller, that is from smooth muscle contraction, right? So constriction of blood vessels. And you can make a really long list of smooth muscle and what it does. The uterus during, labor, that's going to be smooth muscle. The contractions during labor. Certain parts of your esophagus that move through food when you swallow, that are going to be smooth muscle. So we'll learn about lots and lots of varieties of smooth muscle and where they're found throughout this semester and next semester. Okay, but it's involuntary, all right? And it's found in many of the internal organs. Okay, so some characteristics of our smooth muscle cells. So the smooth muscle cells, their shape is they are spindle shape. All right, so they have kind of like a banana shaped. A lot of times this is how people describe it. All right, so they're spindle shaped. Okay, so if I were to draw one, right, it would be kind of like this, right? So they're very thin on the ends, and then they have kind of like a bulge in the middle, all right? And then the bulge, the reason it's there is because that's where the nucleus is located. Okay, so they're spindle shaped, so that would be like one smooth muscle cell, as you can see here, right? So we have these, this would be a good one, right? So these kind of spindle shaped muscle cells here. Okay, they are typically going to have one nucleus per cell. All right, so one nucleus per cell. And this particular type of muscle is not striated. Okay, so it doesn't have those stripes that we see in the cardiac and the skeletal muscle. All right. Okay, good. So then kind of, learn the characteristics of these, what they look like. So skeletal muscle is voluntary. They're these long cylindrical multinucleated cells with striations. Cardiac muscle are these branched cells with one nucleus per cell. They also have striations, and they're connected by intercalated discs, and they are involuntary. And then smooth muscle is also involuntary, does not have striations. They have a spindle shape and one nucleus per cell. Okay? All right, so that's our muscle tissue. So then our last category of tissue is going to be nervous tissue. All right, so nervous tissue, you probably are already guessing where it's going to be found is in, the parts of the nervous system. So this would be the brain, and the spinal cord in particular. All right, is where you would find nervous tissue. Its function is going to be to conduct nerve impulses. And actually its function differs based on the two different types of cells that you find in nervous tissue. So the neurons themselves, that's the first type, they are going to actually send that electrical information, send those impulses. So they send the nerve impulses. And we're going to learn all about this later in the semester and how they talk to each other and all that good stuff. All right, but the neurons are what's doing the communicating. But also in nervous tissue, there are these other cells called neuroglial or glial cells. And so these cells, their job is to support the neuron. All right, so they support the neuron. And you're going to learn later about many different types of glial cells. There's a bunch of different types, and they all do different jobs. But in general, they support the activity and the health of the neuron. All right, and so neurons, interestingly, do not undergo mitosis. All right, so they don't divide, and they don't replicate. These glial cells, however, do. Right, so they undergo a lot of mitosis. And so the reason that's interesting is when you think about brain cancer and tumors. So a tumor in the brain could never arise from an actual neuron, right? They're always going to arise from these glial cells because the neurons are not ever dividing, so they can never multiply out of control because they don't divide. All right, and so that's why a lot of names of different types of tumors come from the names of glial cells. Even, a glioma is kind of a type of brain tumor you may have heard of, right? So glioma is a tumor from a glial cell. Okay. And that actually reminds me, we didn't talk about regeneration with our other two types of muscle. All right, so we talked about with our skeletal muscle, limited regeneration. All right, but with our cardiac muscle, regeneration is almost non-existent. All right, so we're going to say little to no regeneration. All right. And that's really important to understand, especially with the heart attack, because in a heart attack, the muscle tissue in the heart dies. That muscle tissue is not replaced with functioning muscle tissue. It just becomes scar tissue. All right. So it doesn't regenerate, and therefore you can't replace dead heart tissue. All right. And then we also have smooth muscle, which has, of our 3 types of muscle, the best regeneration, right? So good regeneration in our smooth muscle. All right, so if we kind of rank them in the amount of regeneration that they can perform, smooth muscle would be the best, followed by skeletal muscle, which is, pretty good, somewhat limited, and then pretty much none at all for cardiac muscle. So it would have the least level of regeneration. Okay, good. All right, so then that is our skeletal muscle and our nervous tissue. So now let's move on to those additional tissue topics that we mentioned. So the first one we're going to tackle is membranes and different types of membranes. Okay, and so membranes are always going to be made from 2 things. So a membrane is always some type of epithelial tissue with connective tissue underneath it. Okay, and so the type of tissues involved are going to be different depending on the type of membrane that we're talking about. All right, so let's talk about our first type of membrane. So a mucous membrane, right? The epithelium for this is going to be a little different depending on where it's located. So it can be columnar, simple columnar. And it can be pseudostratified. But what they're always going to have in common is lots and lots and lots of goblet cells, all right? Always with goblet cells. That's the mucus part of the mucous membrane. So there's going to be lots of goblet cells producing mucus, right, in whatever the epithelium is that is present. All right, and so then our connective tissue that's underneath that epithelium is areolar connective tissue, and it has a special name. All right, it's called lamina propria. All right, so in our mucous membrane, the connective tissue, the areolar connective tissue underneath is called lamina propria. All right. Okay, so the function of these mucous membranes is obviously to produce mucus, right? So make mucus, right? That can be important. So the digestive system has lots of mucous membranes, so that can be for lubrication. It can also give protection. So in the stomach, there's a lot of mucus lining the epithelium to protect from that stomach acid. All right, so it can provide protection. The respiratory system has lots of mucous membranes. That mucus traps debris, so that would also provide protection. It also can humidify the air, add moisture to the air. Right, because you don't want air to dry out your tissues and your cells. So that mucus helps to add some humidity to the air. All right, your urinary tract is going to have mucous membranes. Those would be to protect because urine is acidic. All right, and your reproductive tract actually has a lot of mucous membranes, and those tend to function more for and we'll add this one, nourishment. So for example, in the female reproductive tract, right, the fallopian tube that the egg travels through after ovulation is lined with mucous membranes, and that mucus helps to nourish the egg as it's traveling towards the uterus. So that mucus can also provide nourishment in some cases. Okay. And so we'll just kind of list some of those locations we just talked about, right? So we have the digestive tract, the GI tract. We have the respiratory tract, the urinary tract, and the reproductive system. And that's in both males and females, so it would nourish developing sperm as well as the egg. All right. Okay, so found in lots of places with a variety of different functions. All right, so that's our mucous membrane. So now let's talk about a serous membrane. Okay, so serous membranes are found lining a lot of body cavities, okay? And so the epithelium in a serous membrane is always going to be simple squamous, all right? Remember that mesothelium we talked about before. So simple squamous. And I'll just put here mesothelium as a reminder. Okay. And the connective tissue underneath it is going to be areolar and sometimes adipose tissue as well. All right, so areolar and adipose. And so a lot of membranes get fat deposits in them as well. A lot of these serous membranes do. So you can have adipose tissue. All right, and so the function of these serous membranes is to produce fluid. So serous actually means kind of like a watery secretion. You're going to hear that a few times in A&P. So serous means there's a watery kind of fluid being made. And so that's the function of these membranes. So they secrete a watery fluid. All right. And that watery fluid provides lubrication. So that's its function. So, for example, all of the organs in your abdominal cavity are lined by these serous membranes. So that way when they're churning and digesting a food, you maybe just ate, they're not rubbing against each other. They have these membranes, they're secreting fluid that'll reduce that friction from them moving around and rubbing together. Okay? All right, so locations, this would be, so the pericardium is made of serous membrane, right? That surrounds the heart. The peritoneum, all right, that's what I was talking about in the abdominal cavity surrounding all the organs, and the pleura. So the pleura would be around the lungs. So those are three examples of serous membranes. All right, and so then we have our synovial membranes, okay? And so a synovial membrane is a little different, only in the respect that the epithelium is not a true epithelium because it contains, so it's not epithelium because it only contains scattered cells. And remember, a characteristic of epithelium is they have to be tightly packed cells. So these cells are scattered. So they aren't actually a true epithelium. All right. But it does contain some cells and they're scattered on the surface. All right. So scattered cells on the surface. Okay. And then the connective tissue underneath is going to be like in our serous membrane, areolar and adipose. All right, and so the function of a synovial membrane is going to be to make synovial fluid. All right, so they're going to make fluid, and they're found in joints. And so synovial fluid is going to cushion and protect joint surfaces. All right, so they make synovial fluid. All right, and so that is going to lubricate joints. Okay, and so that's where they're found. All right, so they're found in joint cavities. All right, and in structures called bursa. So you may have heard of bursitis. So that would be inflammation of a bursa. So a bursa is just like a basically balloon of synovial, made out of synovial membrane, and it fills with synovial fluid, and it provides padding to joints like your knees and your shoulders and your elbows. So both of those, your joint actually is surrounded by synovial membrane, and the bursa are made of synovial membrane. Okay. Then our last type of membrane is a cutaneous membrane. Okay, and so the cutaneous membrane, our epithelial tissue, is going to be keratinized, stratified squamous. All right, so keratinized, stratified squamous. So an example of a cutaneous membrane is your skin. All right, we're going to spend the next chapter talking about the skin. Okay, and so the function of this cutaneous membrane is for protection. All right, and so then our connective tissue underneath that would be areolar tissue. All right, and so our example, as we said, would be the skin. So it provides protection from abrasion and that sort of thing, as well as from fluid loss. So it provides this kind of watertight barrier on the outside of your body so you don't lose fluids as well. All right, so that's a cutaneous membrane. Okay, then our last topic is going to be tissue repair. All right, so let's talk about how tissues, when they're damaged, how they are repaired. All right. So there's two possible types of cells that are involved in tissue repair. So you could have a parenchymal cell that is involved in tissue repair, and these would be functional tissue cells. All right, so these would be cells if they divide, right, and repair the tissue, that tissue would regenerate and be functional again, all right? So this would be regeneration of functional tissue. So that would be ideal, what you want, right? So if you have tissue that's damaged, you want to replace it with the same type of tissue that still functions in the same way that it did before. All right. And so like we said, with skeletal muscle and especially cardiac muscle, that's not really going to happen. All right. So you don't have regeneration with this functional tissue like in cardiac muscle. You don't. Right. So what would happen with cardiac muscle is the repair would come from the second type of cell. So a stromal cell. And so this is just a connective tissue cell. All right, so connective tissue cell. And so if they're involved in repair, you're going to end up with a collagen-based scar, right? That would be scar tissue. And so that is called fibrosis. All right, or fibrosis. Okay, and that's what would happen in the heart. So if heart muscle died, that tissue would be repaired by these stromal cells, and you would just end up with scar tissue in your heart, not functioning cardiac muscle that replaces it. It would be scar tissue. Okay, and so which cell does the repairing determines if that new tissue is actually going to function or if it's not going to be functional. All right, so there are 3 steps involved in the repair process. All right, and so when tissues are damaged, so say you get a laceration on your arm, All right, that actual cut and those damaged cells are going to release chemicals that will trigger this repair process. Okay, and so damaged cells release kind of like, alert signals to the body, telling the body there's damage that needs to be repaired. And so the first thing that's going to trigger is inflammation. Okay, and so inflammation, if you remember, or you may know this already, inflammation, some signs of inflammation are redness, swelling, heat, and pain. And so most often inflammation is going to be triggered by the release of histamine. Okay, and so that's what this is saying. So the damage to the tissue attracts cells called mast cells. All right, mast cells contain granules full of histamine. All right, so with histamine granules. And so when they get to that site where the injury is, they are going to degranulate. And so degranulation just means they're releasing all those granules full of histamine. And so degranulation would be causing histamine release. That histamine is what is going to trigger the inflammation. Okay, so inflammation is really important. It doesn't feel good because it's painful and you've got swelling and it's, your injury will be like hot to the touch. But it is really important for attracting the repair cells and the immune cells to that site of that injury. All right, so it attracts white blood cells. All right, so we can fight any infections and remove any kind of debris and those repair cells. So either our parenchymal or our stromal cells, just depending on the type of tissue that was damaged. Okay. And so with the white blood cells, these would include macrophages and that sort of thing. All right. Okay, so that's our first step. So inflammation triggered by the damaged tissue itself, attracting mast cells, which degranulate, releasing histamine. That histamine causes the inflammation. That inflammation attracts all the cells needed for repair of that tissue. Okay, and so then our next step is the formation of granulation tissue. All right, and so granulation tissue is connective tissue that is actively growing and kind of repairing that area. All right, so it's kind of like a construction site. All right, so you have the connective tissue and it's growing, it's repairing. There's going to be lots and lots of blood vessels to allow more cells and nutrients to get to the area. And so a lot of times if you have like a cut or something and you get like a little scab over it and you try to pick that scab a little too early and you can see blood kind of forming around it, that blood is coming from that granulation tissue. All right, so it's still in that granulation tissue phase, so it hasn't fully healed yet. All right, okay, so that's step 2. And then our last step is going to be maturation, okay, or repair. All right, so maturation phase just involves the final kind of repair process. So if this maturation phase involves regeneration, that would be from our parenchymal cells, right? Because remember, they are going to replace that damaged tissue with functioning tissue. If that maturation phase results in fibrosis, that would be from those stromal cells. Okay. All right, good. Okay, so then that is it for our tissue chapter. It's a lot to study. and get organized, and all the tissues kind of organized in your head and what they do. So make sure you start studying that early, all right? So you can kind of digest this extremely important chapter, because going forward, it's just going to be assumed that in each continuing chapter, you know what these tissues are, all right? And so, especially in A&P2, when you go into the organ systems, we'll just start talking about, the digestive system, and it's assumed that when we talk about all the different layers of tissue in the stomach, that you know what each of those tissues is, okay? So this is a very important chapter for understanding future material, all right? So